Good afternoon. Welcome to New America. I'm Peter Bergen. I run the International Security Program. It's really a great pleasure to introduce two people who've had a long association with New America in different kinds of ways. First of all, Rabia Chaudry, who is a senior fellow at the U.S. Institute of Peace. She's been working in the field of countering violent extremism for many years. She just returned, in fact, from Pakistan, where she was meeting with a group of people, militant groups, for instance, Jaish Mohammed and Sabah, and anybody who follows Pakistani militant groups knows these are very serious militant organizations. She's written the new book that she'll explain the big stories and themes of, which was a New York Times bestseller. And next to her is Marsha Chatelain, who is a professor at Georgetown, who's also a recently minted New America Fellow, who's going to be writing about the way that McDonald's and the sort of intersected with minority groups and the way in which McDonald's has kind of interacted with African American business owners, African American neighborhoods, and she's also interestingly part of the committee. Georgetown, of course, recognized recently that it had a very dark episode involving the sale of slaves, and Marsha has been involved in helping the university think through how to deal with this episode in its history. So Rabia is going to start, and then Marsha will comment on Rabia's observations. So thank you.
Thank you, Peter, and good afternoon, everybody. I want to thank New America for hosting this. Thank you, David, so much for helping organize, and Peter for moderating. I know he's got a very busy schedule, and everybody else who came together to pull this, and certainly Marsha for joining us. So first of all, I want to just kind of ask the question. It's always I'm always like a little bit confused about kind of like when people show up to these events, and we've had many, many events about the case, about the book, and about serial in general. What it is they're particularly interested in. For the most part, a lot of audience questions seem to revolve around very specific cases about very specific questions about Adnan's case. But sometimes people want to talk about policy issues and things of that sort. But let me just start off by asking, how many people listen to Serial? Okay, good. How many? So I don't have to explain the basics. How many people listen to Undisclosed? Oh, that's pretty good. Okay. How many people have the book? You can do better. All right.
Yeah. Well, you're going to do better because they have a sale outside. And Rabia will be signing books after the event.
Yeah. So I'm going to start off actually talking a little bit about the issue of wrongful convictions broadly, and then I'm going to get more specifically talk about the phenomena of serial and what has happened in Adnan's case in the last couple of years and my involvement. So yesterday, October 4th, was National Wrongful Conviction Day. And quite honestly, a couple of years ago, I did not even know such a thing existed. Because to be honest, I have never been an advocate on criminal justice issues. I have only had a personal tie to Adnan and therefore been his advocate. But my legal career was not in criminal defense. It was in immigration and civil rights. And then I moved into the CVE space, which is countering violent extremism. And I have done work with New America for a couple of years on that. And I'm currently at the U.S. Institute of Peace, which is still my day job, working on CVE and extremism issues. But having said that, it was National Wrongful Conviction Day, I think what's really interesting is in the last 5 years, there has been the frequency of exonerations is increasing every single year. In the past 5 years, I think we've seen about 500 exonerations in the country, but every year that number, like I think the last year was 150, the year before that was 130, years before that around 100. But even that number of people that we're seeing exonerated in a very public way is really just what we're seeing on the surface. Those happen to be the cases that some organization, some individual took on successfully and fought all the way through the system. And I'm going to talk about that in relationship with Adnan's case too. There was a new state filing today as well in his case. That's only representative of the cases that out of hundreds of cases that any given, let's say, Innocence Project or other such organization takes, they're able to successfully exonerate. The numbers of wrongful convictions, our estimates are like all over the place, but Wayne State University study estimated about 10,000 people a year are wrongfully convicted. There are some experts who estimate as high as 15 to 20% of people in this country who are incarcerated are wrongfully convicted. And, you know, the wrongful convictions are not always for like a case like Adnan's, which is a murder case. We're talking about the entire gamut of criminal offenses, you know, from assault to rape to robbery to all these things. You can be wrongfully convicted of lots of different things. So what we've had to happen in the last couple of years as Adnan's case has gained so much attention is we've been very lucky in that we've had a lot of prominent people who work in wrongful conviction come out to support us, including Barry Scheck and the National Innocence Project. They're working with us on Adnan's case. But others, like Jeffrey Descovich, who is an exoneree himself. He runs an organization called the Jeffrey Descovich Foundation. They take on, they vet different cases, and they decide every year to take 2 or 3 cases, and they've exonerated successfully a number of people. It costs a lot of money. But I bring up Jeff Descovich because he, in a talk that he gave earlier this year, flagged a number of things that are very common in wrongful conviction cases. And he said that, you know, even though it seems like when people listen to Adnan's case in serial, which almost, for so many people who are not familiar with the criminal justice system, now when lawyers listen to this, so many lawyers contacted us and said, well, this is kind of a run-of-the-mill case. All this stuff that you're talking about happens all the time. But people who are not familiar with the criminal justice system, their minds were blown because they're like, how can any of this happen? Like, is this really how the legal system works? But these are some very common red flags that you see in wrongful convictions. One informant with some incentive, but no other evidence tying the defendant to the crime, right? So in this case, it was Jay Wilds. There was no physical evidence tying Adnan to the crime. That informant story changing and evolving, and that informant getting things wrong over and over. Bad lawyering. Of course, in this case, I mean defense counsel, and in this case we had a defense counsel who was severely impaired at the time she was representing Adnan. Alibis not presented. A lot of people are very surprised when they say, oh wow, Adnan had like a potential alibi witness at the time of the murder. It wasn't presented. This actually happens a lot in wrongful conviction cases. If anybody has been following Making a Murder in the Stephen Avery case, in the rape case that he was actually convicted in, he had like, I think over a dozen alibi witnesses that were even presented, and he was still convicted, wrongfully convicted of the case. So the failure of presenting alibi witnesses, you know, effectively is another hallmark. Prosecutorial misconduct almost always happens on some level, and that there is an alternative suspect that could be viable but is never thoroughly investigated. And in Adnan's case, I would say that suspect would be Don, who was the victim's boyfriend at the time, who, if you think about this, when they are investigating the case, they did not even fingerprint. They did not take hair samples from. They didn't take any kind of DNA samples from him, even though they found some forensic evidence on her body and in the car, which didn't match Adnan, didn't match anybody, but they didn't do it something as simple as collect that evidence from other potential suspects. Because what they tend to do, what tends to happen in wrongful convictions is that investigators decide, this is our guy, this is our person, and then they build a case around it. Now, when somebody is wrongfully convicted, or even rightfully convicted, but certainly when they're wrongfully convicted, one of the toughest things to then suffer is the appellate process. It is an incredibly restrictive process. It is very expensive and very difficult to have a conviction overturned. This February will be 18 years since Adnan was arrested. It has taken 12 episodes of Serial, 40 episodes of Undisclosed, 36 episodes of Truth and Justice podcast, a book, millions of dollars in legal fees to get us this far. And so, you know, this is something that I think people don't understand. It's not a matter of, oh, okay, guess what, there's some DNA evidence somewhere. All you got to do is test it and it'll be done. In the state of Maryland, the last time a petitioner, an inmate asked that DNA evidence in a locker be tested to prove he didn't commit the crime, the state fought back for 6 years. They didn't want the evidence tested. So, you know, all of these things, now for me, this has also been a learning process because I didn't practice criminal defense, but it has been surprising for me to understand that the criminal justice system is not, or at least the state's interest is not necessarily getting all the information in front of it. It is simply getting the information, for the most part, that can support the result that they want. And this is extremely problematic, which takes us to the issue of criminal justice reform and how to address all these things. But before, and I know Marsha's going to talk a little bit about that, but I want to talk a little bit about why Adnan's case has been very different from other wrongful conviction cases, because true crime has always been of interest to people. We love true crime. But I get asked all the time, what was it about Adnan's case that just made it explode, right? 500 million downloads of Serial, 100 million downloads of Undisclosed, like what's happening? And I don't know the answer to that, because I'm not like a third-party observer. Like, I wasn't someone who got hooked to the case. This is a very personal matter to me. But what I did realize, as somebody who's been an advocate in the Muslim community for many years, working on lots of issues, anti-Muslim bigotry, surveillance issues, civil rights issues, is that Sarah Koenig and Serial they were able to do what we as activists have really failed to do. Anti-Muslim bigotry is higher today than it was right after 9/11. Anti-Muslim sentiment is very high. Hate crimes, the rates of hate crimes increase. So how was Sarah able to take the story of a Muslim guy who is very Muslim-looking, whose family is very Muslim-looking, whose advocate looks like me, and make him palatable and make him somebody people want to support? And people have donated almost like $500,000 for his legal defense. Adnan's gotten about 10,000 letters in prison in the last 2 years. How was she able to do that when we Muslim activists couldn't do that? We couldn't do it for like almost any story at all. And it was because she was able to really effectively tell a great story and make it a human story and not make it about issues. And I think going forward, what I realize is that people access issues through human stories. It's not the other way around. And we've been doing it the other way around, where we say, well, surveillance is an issue, and police brutality is an issue, and these are issues. But instead, what's happened is, and social media has taught us this lesson too, that it has to be, people access the issues through human stories. When Serial launched, I was actually in the middle of my project here at New America, and that project was a project that was funded mostly by Google. And what we were doing was we went around the country and we did about 10 trainings for Muslim American organizations and activists and leaders on how to use social media for their own activism and advocacy, and basically to showcase their work better. And the purpose of that was to both fight back anti-Muslim bigotry, but also fight back against violent extremist narratives by Muslim violent extremists. So I had spent, by the time Serial launched, I had already spent about 1.5 years attending these trainings. And I wasn't a social media expert, but I sat in the room over and over again as the trainers would train. And so when Serial launched, I was like, oh my gosh, I got to use all these tools that I learned through the New America program. So I began tweeting, I began blogging, I began crowdsourcing. And that is what took us from Serial being an amazing story, and that was a lot of fun, to actually getting Adnan's conviction overturned. It took a lot of social media activism, and I wouldn't have had those tools if I wasn't able to have done that project here at New America, so I'm very grateful for that. But it also brings home the power of social media on all of these issues that we work on, whether it's police reform, Black Lives Matter, civil rights issues. From the Arab Spring onwards, the power of social media is very obvious. So quick update on Adnan's case, and then I'll turn it over. I don't even know how long I've been talking for, but people keep asking what's going on in Adnan's case. In June, his conviction was overturned by the Circuit Court in Maryland, and it was overturned by the same judge who denied it a couple of years ago. The state immediately appealed that conviction being overturned. The state wants to fight it. We then responded. The state filed another one, and this is the problem. The problem is that, at the states, we're lucky that we have the funds to keep fighting this, but most people might not have the funds to do that. The state has at its disposal our taxpayer dollars, and they will keep fighting and fighting and fighting. We see this in many wrongful convictions. They are going to fight this until they are up against the wall, and we expect it. So we are now going to wait for the Court of Appeals to decide whether or not to uphold that, the judge's decision. If they uphold it, Adnan gets a new trial. Will the state go back to court? I don't know what they could go back to court with. They don't have a lot of evidence anymore. The evidence we've found since in the last 2 years contradicts everything that they presented at trial. And we'll see. We also have a major filing coming up in the next few weeks that could make a difference, which is, I'm just going to tell you to keep your eyes open, but I can't say what it is because his lawyer will kill me. And that's it. But I do really believe that in the next year that Adnan will be home. I think that's where we are. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wow. So I enter this conversation as an academic and as someone who uses social media as a platform to talk about some of the issues that Rabia mentions, as well as the larger context in which we're living. And so I think it's interesting, you know, Facebook sends these memories to you so you can feel wistful throughout the day. But 2 years ago, Serial debuted today. And in this 2-year period, I think of Serial as existing in a space that one scholar calls the American Spring, in terms of a broad-based consciousness about the problems of race and policing. And so if we think about Adnan's story surfacing among a listening audience months after the Ferguson uprising, within a year of the conversation about the Baltimore Police Department and Freddie Gray, we see ourselves uniquely steeped in a moment in which we, as everyday people, people who may be removed from the criminal justice system, are now engaged in a very deep conversation about the various places where we see that it's broken. And so one of the things that I think is really exciting about the tools of podcasting and of social media, people are now having everyday conversations about issues that are easily obscured if you don't have contact with a family member or a loved one who is incarcerated, or you yourself has been incarcerated, or have had incidents of police violence. And so I think that as someone who writes about race and as a historian, I'm trying to place this within a context of other moments in which the level of the public consciousness was just absolutely raised. And we can see moments, for instance, in the environmental movement. We can see moments in racial justice and movements. But I think that this moment is particularly hopeful because we are seeing a broad-based, racially diverse, ethnically diverse movement about criminal justice emerging out of many communities. And the sense that someone from within your own community has to be the victim of this in order for you to care, I think we're shifting in that way. And so one of the things that I think was really great about the response to Serial and Undisclosed is that I think your podcast made very clear the Islamophobia and the anti-Muslim sentiments that were so deeply embedded in the investigation, the prosecutorial strategy, as well as, you know, the perspectives of the jury. I think that audiences needed to hear and see that at the same time that members of the public are reading the Ferguson report from the Department of Justice. And so if we see this kind of all together, what does this mean for everyday citizens? A few takeaways that I have found from this. One, I never imagined that criminal justice reform would be a bipartisan issue in which the Koch brothers, Cory Booker, Rand Paul, President Obama are all thinking about how do we dismantle this problem. Now, they're all motivated by different perspectives. But the idea that criminal justice is front and center, I think, is an incredible shift over the past 50 years from when we first heard law and order as a strategy for a presidential candidate. I think that the second thing that I will say, and that's also really important when we think about the work of the New America Foundation in rethinking education broadly defined, the ability for these platforms to provide a sophisticated level of analysis to a larger and larger audience. I don't think that we can underestimate the value of Serial and then Undisclosed in helping people understand the various parts of the criminal justice system that leads to wrongful conviction, that can support and uphold brutality and misconduct. I think that what we're going to see increasingly is a series of social justice movements that are synthesizing the work that's happening on the ground in the streets and using the digital platforms in order to recruit more members toward it. There's a really interesting way in which people have galvanized around Adnan's case and feel like they're part of a movement for justice. And we're redefining what it means to be a citizen that can hold these larger systems accountable. And I think that this is also the offshoot of the Ferguson Rebellion. One of the reasons why I think Black Lives Matter has done such an outstanding job as a movement, despite all of the criticisms and all of the challenges, is that they gave a vocabulary and a very quick education to a broad public about the various structures that allow racial injustice to reproduce and to grow. And so in the moments out of the killing of Michael Brown, you had a conversation about overcharging people, municipal ticketing as a strategy for municipal budgets, about the ways that the education system in Ferguson had also failed the citizens, about the rising tide of poverty, the militarization of the police, these surveillance strategies. So there's a way in which these stories, these hooks into people's curiosity, become a platform for understanding the complicated way that racial injustice has been able to stand, despite all of the different ways that we see progress in other areas of life in America. And so I think that when we think about criminal justice reform now, and we think about the accessibility of information about it, it all kind of comes back to a dynamic partnership that we're also seeing with activists on the ground, academics at colleges and universities like myself, and a larger demand from the public to make visible systems that were behind either a wall of confusion or a wall of ignorance. And so I think that this is a really exciting time for anyone who's interested in racial justice and for social change to observe the various ways that these different worlds are interacting and actually pushing the conversation forward.
Great. Well, thank you both for those very rich observations. So, Rabia, for those who don't know, how did you get involved in the case? Question one, and question two, do the thought experiment where this was a TV series. Was it the nature of the medium that drew people to, and because why was this a story that brought so many people to get involved? And
so, I mean, I have been involved in this case from the day Adnan was arrested, because I've known Adnan since he was 13 years old, and he is my younger brother's best friend. So his family, his parents, my parents, they live in the same little subdivision in the suburbs of Baltimore, and they lived there in '99. They still live there. It's a very big Muslim community that's coalesced around this major mosque in Maryland, and so they've all been kind of part of the same community. So the day Adnan was arrested, we saw it on the news. I was at my mom's. I was visiting my mother, and I saw it, and I was just shocked. I had been following this story about this young woman who's missing and disappeared, and then later her body was found, but I had no idea there was a connection to Adnan in any way. And we immediately actually went over to his house at the same time, and there's news footage of me and my mother talking to the cameras that had gathered outside after his arrest. So since that time, I was in law school at the time, and I assumed very naively that they found a good attorney, very high billable hours attorney, which means she's got to be competent, and I just kind of stayed away from the case itself until he was convicted, and then I realized, oh wow, lots of things went really wrong here. And then since his conviction, I got very involved in the appellate process, finding the right attorneys, making sure everything was filed on time. And so it's just been me going through the appeals with his family, losing appeal after appeal. And the community kind of faded away. And my family was really one of the only families that still remained connected to him and to his family. So that's what propelled me eventually, after losing appeal after appeal, to contact a reporter. It's interesting, the question about if this was a TV series, would it have been different? It might have been different. I think it would have brought me a lot more anxiety, to be honest. Even when Sarah and I first met, I wondered how, I knew she had to meet Adnan. I mean, that had to happen. And having worked as an activist and understanding how people's perceptions and biases about Muslims will color even facts and how they understand things are happening, especially after 9/11. I worried about Sarah meeting Adnan and him looking like this archetypical, prison Muslim with a big beard, and he's a built-out guy. Now he's not that skinny little 17-year-old who's very non-threatening looking. He's tall and he wears a skull cap, and I worried about that. And I thought, I don't know how that's going to impact her reporting. If she's going to see him and think, well, maybe all that Muslim stuff is true that they brought up at the trial. I think, and maybe I just, having done this work for so long, have fears that maybe are not well founded, but I wonder if it was a TV series, if people would be as, simply because of the optics of the situation,
And so Sarah is the producer, right?
Sarah was the lead investigator, journalist, producer of Serial, yeah.
Yeah, and how did you hook up with her?
So I just began Googling, looking for somebody who had written about the case in '99 or who had written about his attorney. And she used to work for, I think, the Baltimore Sun in '99 or 2000, and she had written about when his attorney got disbarred. So I just reached out to her. She was the very first person I contacted. I emailed. I thought, if she's not interested, I'll move on to another journalist. And she responded very, very quickly, like the next day or so.
And had her background being, and what was, you mentioned she worked at the Baltimore Sun. Did she, I mean, she's obviously a very skillful producer of, had she done much of this before? Or?
When I looked her up, I realized that she's at This American Life. And I've heard of This American Life. I actually had never listened to any of their productions. And it wasn't what I was looking for, because I was looking for a local reporter, somebody who really was connected to the system, to the players on the ground. That would have made sense to me, who knew snitches, who knew the cops and the prosecutors. But I don't know. I don't know why. I really don't know why I thought I'm going to contact her, but I did. And there's a part of me, I guess now, is like, and I guess it was kind of meant to be. And also I did know that This American Life had resources, so they would be able to bring a lot of resources to the investigation.
Yeah. And Marsha, for you, so, criminal justice is one of the few areas where there is a sort of, it's transpartisan almost, is what you might refer it to. So how do you feel about the Koch brothers being sort of deeply involved in?
So here are my concerns about the way that criminal justice reform is becoming a big tent. I think largely one of the forces that animates that is the fact that there's concern about whites being victims of it. I think that the way that we talk about the heroin crisis as motivating the reason to be softer on drug crimes is all about race. So the racial caste system that allowed for the war on drugs is the same racial caste system that is being, cuddly about drugs. We have to be very clear about what this means. And so it's one of these things where I think in terms of coalitional politics, many people understand what's happening, but they also understand that there could be a collateral benefit to a critical mass of people of color to think more broadly. And I think that these are the dilemmas of making change. It's the strange bedfellows that are engendered by the fact that we have this massive system that needs dismantling. And so I think it is great that the Koch brothers are funding projects and are thinking about these issues. And at the same time, the danger of that is when any organization buys entry into a movement, nothing is free. And so I think that each organization and each individual has to account with the political consequences of these types of partnership. And at the same time, I'm glad that people are actually caring about hyper-sentencing for drugs, the need for more drug courts and the need for a more humane approach to the criminal justice system broadly.
If you have a question, can you raise your hand and identify yourself and wait for the mic?
I'm curious to ask how criminal justice reform relates to Adnan's case. And to the extent that specific reforms that you're talking about were implemented, how would that have changed the way Adnan's experience played out? Are we talking about reforms, the way in which prosecutions gather the evidence presented in court? Are we talking about rehabilitative programs in prison? What is it exactly about the criminal justice reform agenda that you think has an impact on Adnan's case?
I'll give one example, although I think there's multiple examples in this case itself, and that is this. Adnan was 17 at the time that this crime occurred. He was a juvenile. As a juvenile, he was sentenced to life plus 30 years. Not too long ago, the U.S. Supreme Court found that it's unconstitutional to sentence juvenile offenders to life in prison without parole. In Maryland, it is effectively without parole because parole is never granted. So recently, the ACLU brought a lawsuit in Maryland to go back and revise. There's about 200 juvenile offenders whose sentences will be revisited, including Adnan's. Just recently, his case has been assigned to a case manager. So what's interesting is whether or not the appellate process works for us, his sentence might actually be revisited and revised based on this new ruling that could mean his early release anyways, that he has served the time that a juvenile offender should have been. So things like not just overcharging, but really kind of unconscionable sentencing had a big impact on Adnan's case, and we have a big issue with very, very long sentences. There's no other country in I think, the world that gives sentences as long as we do, even for some very minor, I mean, like drug offenses to other kinds of offenses.
If I can add to that, material support in terrorism cases is, 20 years. Often these are, sometimes these are kids who are 19. And of course, the way the system works in this country is there's a 1% acquittal rate in a terrorism case. So no attorney is going to advise you other than to take a plea. So, one of the things I find interesting is the very, very lengthy prison sentences for material support, which can be the crime. It's almost like it's not quite a thought crime, but it's getting close, because in a lot of these cases, it's the idea that, hey, I was planning to join a jihadi group. The material support, you never get there. You're arrested at the airport. Obviously, it's very bad judgment, but there's no one has said that you were planning an act of violence or that you have a violence in your background. And so certainly that's one area where I think, and obviously this disproportionately falls on Muslim Americans.
I think another element of it, when we think about the various prongs of the call for criminal justice reform, we often focus on drug crimes because of the mandatory minimums. And there's so many aspects of Adnan's case that is an outlier for a number of reasons, including the support he's been able to receive. But I think also the quality of prisons and the programs available are also within that larger umbrella. And so I think at Jessup, he kind of was at the point where there was no more resources for him in terms of his education.
Now as well.
And so when we think about these problems, it isn't just about sentencing, it's about the ways that prisoners' rights to religion, their education, and their health also kind of fit within that umbrella.
Another one that I think is really important, because to me this is one of the most. If I could pick one specific place in this entire system that I think is broken in so many different ways to start, it would be with accountability of state actors. In Adnan's case, you have prosecutors who have been found to commit Brady violations, which is like a deliberate withholding of evidence. You shouldn't be able to practice law after that. You should not be able to stay in the office, representing the state, upholding justice when you have been shown to commit these kinds of violations. You have prosecutors who end up becoming judges and who have been, again, found by a court, by a judge to have committed Brady violations. We have some more issues in Adnan's case. So I think accountability, whether it's for police officers who are, clearly, visibly on camera committing brutality, to prosecutors who never pay, ever pay, have any accountability for their misconduct. I think these are major reform issues.
I'm curious, you talked a bit about the effect of social media on these particular cases, and I'm wondering, aside from getting people talking and expanding the conversation, what effect do you think these cases that are so publicized that has had on the outcome? For instance, with Making a Murderer, having everyone so engaged in that show, and then recently the effect on Brendan Dassey's case. If you think that the public sort of spotlight on these cases as having or putting pressure on the judicial system or the prosecutors or anything along those lines, because it seems like there's got to be some correlation with the amount of accountability that's now highlighted.
Yeah, I think the proof is in the pudding, so to say. I think whether it's the Making a Murder case, Adnan's case, and there's actually a number of other cases that have...
Explain what Making a Murder is, just please.
Making a Murder is a Netflix series, a documentary series that focused on a murder case in Wisconsin. The main defendant is Stephen Avery, who, his attorneys believe that he has been wrongfully convicted the second time in his life. He had served 18 years for a previous crime, but in the second charging, his 16-year-old nephew, Brendan Dassey, was also charged. And this child on video, I mean, in his interrogations, they're just unconscionable. It's so clear that he's being coerced, that he has a low IQ, as does Stephen Avery. It raises a lot of issues about how policing can be so corrupt and kind of terrifying in these small town situations. For Brendan Dassey, his conviction was overturned. I don't know how many years he's served now, 10, 11 years already. The state is still fighting back. The state is saying, no, we're still going to fight it, even though it's so obvious that this child should never have been convicted of this crime, and nothing he had to offer should have been admissible in court. But I think I absolutely don't, I'll tell you the truth. If we had been able to present the evidence that we presented to the circuit court, which is both Asia McLean's testimony and this facts cover evidence that we just presented in February, without the benefit of the public spotlight, I don't know if his conviction would have been overturned. Simple as that. It makes all the difference in these kinds of cases, and that is both heartening in some cases, but it's also really kind of depressing because very few cases can get this kind of attention. Having said that, I think in the last year, I mean, there's at least 5 or 6 new podcasts about different cases, cold cases, wrongful convictions, that are trying to replicate what Serial has done, what Making a Murder is doing. Undisclosed, we are on our second case now, a case out of Georgia. And we do believe that this defendant is innocent, and we also do believe that we will help exonerate him too. So it's, but it's very laborious work. It's one case at a time, and unless you have like kind of more broad measures to fix the system, like whether it's conviction integrity units or innocence commissions or something like that, it's always going to be a slog.
Gentleman here.
Hello, I work for AFP. I have a question on Adnan's case. I'd like to know if you have an indication of the interest about this case abroad, outside the US, whether it is in terms of downloads, whether it is in terms of maybe translations of the story, of the book, of the series.
Yeah, so I can't speak for statistics for Serial, although I know when Serial aired, it became the #1 podcast in the UK, in Ireland, in Australia. I have given interviews to I think half the Western world, CNN India. Undisclosed, we get about 2 million listens per episode, and those are about half in the US, but the other half, the other million, is spread across UK, Australia, Ireland. I don't know why Ireland's so interested, but anyway, I've been on Irish radio many times now. And so there is definitely interest everywhere. This is kind of a global phenomenon. It hasn't been. We held a fundraising banquet in March called Night for Justice Gala, in which we honored a lot of people who've worked on Adnan's case. We had people fly in from Germany, from Australia, from the UK, just to attend this banquet. So it's been kind of remarkable.
What is the case in Georgia that you're focusing on now?
The case in Georgia, the defendant's name is Joey Watkins. It's a case in which he was charged with, he was also, I think, 18 years old at the time, charged with a 2000 murder of another young man, 19-year-old Isaac Dawkins. And ridiculous case. If you think Adnan's case is like bereft of evidence, well, it's even more egregious in Joey Watkins' case, and he received a life sentence. So we have been, I think we're like 15 episodes in or 13 episodes in, and we're not just doing the episodes, we're doing a lot of investigation behind the scenes. So we have found new evidence. He has lawyers on the ground working on those things, and So we're pretty confident that we can hopefully move the needle on his case.
How do you manage, I mean, you're also a practicing attorney and you're doing the
Well, no,
USIP work and...
yeah.
I mean,
So I haven't been practicing in 5 years. Because
Okay.
if I did that, then I would
Yeah.
basically just, I don't know. I'd never sleep. No, I stopped practicing about 5 years ago, actually to work in the CVE policy space full time. That's been my interest. Also kind of burned out. But USIP is my full-time job. CVE is where my kind of passion is. But yeah, juggling that, the podcast. My other co-host, Susan Simpson, who I don't know if she didn't make it, but she was going to try to make it, and Colin Miller both have full-time jobs. We just make it work. We manage it, and we were able to raise with undisclosed the advertising revenue almost $200,000 for Adnan's legal fund from advertising. I mean, podcasting is not just effective advocacy, but actually can be quite lucrative. Who knew?
you had a follow-up?
It's more a personal question about your relationship with Adnan. When you listen to Serial, you end up, I mean, like I did, you end up with many questions about his guilt. Like Sarah, I think also followed the path where at the end you have more questions than certainties. As far as you are concerned, you seem to have this entrenched belief about his innocence. I'd like to know if it has been the case the whole 18 years, and did it happen that you wondered, did he do it sometime?
Oh, I have never for once thought that he is not just capable of doing it as a human being, because I've known him. I know who he is as a person, but also because the facts didn't add up. At no time from the trial to today has there ever been any evidence to show that Adnan could have committed the murder. From the timeline, which was ridiculous, to this state's witness who also was completely not credible, whose stories kept changing, there was just no evidence. I mean, the evidence they collected from the crime scene showed that it wasn't Adnan. They collected hair from her body, it didn't match Adnan, right? They found blood, it didn't match Adnan. They tore his room up, his clothing, his car to find one single soil sample to match from the park, and they couldn't find it. So.
If I remember well, the last episode of Serial, Sarah said, if I had to be a member of the jury, I would be really, really concerned because I have no certainty this is the case, and this is what she said. So you must have been very disappointed by that.
I mean, at the time that Sarah came to that conclusion, I could understand in a way where she was. But I also personally don't think Sarah knows the criminal justice system as well as, let's say, people who have been working in wrongful conviction advocacy for many years. I don't think she saw the red flags. I mean, to this day, just yesterday, there was a new interview published in which that she gave on a podcast in which she said that she believes in Adnan's case the system worked on a very high level. Yeah, she said this, and I have maintained that every part of the system failed Adnan in this case. If one part of it worked, if only his defense attorney was competent, if only the investigators followed the evidence, if one part, and so I don't know what the disconnect is. I am simultaneously very appreciative to Sarah and Serial, but it doesn't mean I can't be critical, but I cannot compel her to believe one way or the other. I mean, if she doesn't, the big problem for me is that after Serial, a lot of evidence was found after Serial, and I feel like they are not paying attention to that evidence for whatever reason. If it's because they're done with the story, it would be easier for them to say, we're just done with the story, so whatever happens is, happens.
Just a note on that. I think that in a lot of ways, criminal justice and policing is probably one of the greatest racial Rorschach tests of the United States, in which what we are looking at in front of us is so shaped by our position and our belief in such systems that on the podcast when Sarah said she didn't think that anti-Muslim bias played a role in the case, it was kind of astounding because you had jurors being very anti-Muslim in their iterations. And so I think that many of these analysis of this case and others are about a distance to these systems.
We should have got Sarah to come.
I don't know if Sarah would ever share a stage with me. I would welcome it if she could. But I'll give you an example of what she's saying. And the Serial team had all of the records before them. In the transcript of the first trial, before the trial began, and this is the trial that ended in a mistrial, the judge said to Adnan's attorney, Christina Gutierrez, Ms. Gutierrez, am I right to assume that apparently like this case has a lot to do with the defendant's religion? And his lawyer said, yes, it does. I mean, that is how the first trial began, and these were like in the pretrial motions. And so it's, for them to try to separate that out now and say, no, none of that made sense, none of that was actually part of it, is completely bogus. And so I also was, but then when Sarah says, when Sarah showed skepticism about that, I completely agree with Marcia that I understand this because she has not encountered, she will never encounter the system the way I will, or the person of color will, or Adnan will.
Gentleman in the back.
So specific to wrongful convictions, it strikes me as there's a lot of focus on after the fact. And it just strikes me as that's such a more costly and painful process. I'm kind of interested to hear before the conviction actually happens. I mean, what are the things to focus on to fix the problem from that perspective? Because once the wrongful conviction happens, it's so much more costly and painful and takes more time. So it just strikes me as there's all this focus after the fact. What are the places to focus on before the wrongful conviction even happens?
First of all, I just want to apologize also because I know like there's like a little switcheroo that just happened here. Peter had let us know beforehand he has to step out. He has to go out of town quickly, and thank you, David, for taking over. I think, for me, looking at this and looking at other cases, the buck has to stop with the defense attorney. It has to stop with it. As much as we want reform and we want to, clamp down on prosecutorial misconduct, if you look at, and if you read the book, you will see exactly how in this case the prosecutor did everything possible to make sure that Adnan and his attorney could not get any kind of information about the charges even, or about the case itself. So I'll give you an example. She did not know until about a week before the trial, or a few days before the trial, that cell phone evidence was even going to be raised. She had no idea this was an element of the crime. Christina Gutierrez filed multiple motions saying, we don't know, we have not been given the witness statements. We don't know what the state is alleging. You want me to prepare an alibi for my client. I don't even know what the state is alleging. Because, and how do I prepare an alibi when I don't know what time you're telling me she was killed, where she was killed, nothing. They didn't turn over Jay's statements to Christina Gutierrez until the court forced it, and I think it happened a couple days, or the day of the trial. Jen's statements were not turned over until the second trial. I mean, so you have prosecutors playing all these games. But for a defense attorney, now in this case, I mean, it was so egregious that the defense attorney tried to get something as obvious that they would need for the defense as the autopsy report, contacted the medical examiner's office, and the office responded and said, the prosecutor has told us we cannot turn it over to you. Okay, so they don't even have an autopsy report to prepare the defense. But ordinarily, if you don't have a prosecutor operating like this, the defense counsel should be able to get all of everything that the police has gathered, the evidence, and then also do their own investigation. Gutierrez, having been paid the amount she's been paid, and that's the problem. Most defendants don't have the resources, but she should have been able to do an independent investigation, get the autopsy report, get forensics done herself. In this case, swabs were taken from the victim's body, oral swabs, genital swabs, and the prosecutor put testing on hold. They have never been tested. That was Gutierrez's job to make sure they got tested. So you have to make sure that your defense counsel is following every single lead possible, independent of the police's investigation, to do their own investigation. I think that's really important to do. But it's just not possible for a lot of people because of resources, and that's the complication here.
I would say that advocacy for proper public defense, I mean, in some states, people are talking about the average time people have with their clients of 12 minutes. The state of Missouri brought in the governor as a private attorney and say, you represent some of these cases. And so we have to have advocacy on the citizen level and an expectation that we have a robust public defense system available, because this is what makes your case, again, an outlier, that there was actually counsel that was brought in who was ineffective, but you can only imagine if you're relying on a public defender who has 8 minutes, 12 minutes to spend with you on your case.
And bail reform also can address some of these issues, and this is something that Adnan's bail attorneys have been advocating on for many years now, is that having a bail reform system that actually grants bail more easily would allow defendants to go out and be able to actually help in their own defense. I mean, somebody who's incarcerated is so limited in helping with their own defense. They can't meet people. They can't look back at their own records. They cannot help collect evidence themselves. And I think that could also be very helpful.
This dude's there.
Hi, thanks. I'm Mike Gerling. I'm a researcher on CV issues. So, excuse me, if I ask you to take a step back from Adnan's case and ask you to perhaps draw some links between how your work on CVE has informed and given you insights into the situation of Adnan, and then vice versa, what new reflections on CVE have you taken from this process of engaging with the criminal justice system here in the US? Often CVE work overseas talks about the relationship between citizens and the state and governance, and here in the US, of course, whether there are lessons for how the police deal with and engage with minority communities.
So, up until Serial happened, all of my CVE work was domestic, and it was very limited and focused. I mean, the crux of the CVE work I was doing was simply engaging local law enforcement to understand how the Muslim community works, operates, give them cultural competency training, also give them good information on where what people didn't quite understand actually from the outset is that most local law enforcement are not deeply involved with counterterrorism. So they are actually informed by how we're informed. They're informed by social media. They're informed by regular media. I had an intelligence officer tell me from a state police department that when I need to learn something about Muslims, I just Google it. There isn't sufficient training. That's really dangerous. So there isn't good training that they're given, and so much of their own policies and how they're going to approach people in their own jurisdiction is going to be shaped by the same kinds of biases that impact policing across the board. And so when we've had issues, and we continue to have issues with surveillance, with Joint Terrorism Task Force, and with informants, I got into CVE because I was an immigration attorney, which is a very it's not a real controversial legal field, but I had a couple dozen, or at least a dozen clients, I would say, who in a very short time span came to me as immigrants and said, we have federal law enforcement officers leaning on us to become informants in the community, and to just, not because of an imminent threat, but because we just want you to gather information and give it to us, or we're going to make sure you're deported. And that's how I got involved in these issues, because I was trying to understand where these policies are coming from. These policies are mostly coming from not understanding this community, not knowing this community, and also taking an issue like transnational terrorism and turning it into really kind of blowing it out of proportion. And we've thrown billions of dollars into counterterrorism and CVE and police surveillance that has resulted in almost nothing. Many of our convictions are convictions that are, that require FBI kind of agent provocateurs that are creating a case. So, but this is deeply tied to how people in policymaking positions think and feel about Muslims, and it's become politicized, and that's what it is. So, for me, working in CVE was about working about, wrong information on Islam and Muslims. It was about anti-Muslim bigotry. It was about all these things, and all these things appear in Adnan's case. So going back and looking at, how the police investigated Adnan's case, as appalling as it was, it's not surprising to me. I mean, this is how agencies approach, ethnic communities. I mean, and so how it impacts the other way, I don't know if I have an answer for that, but I do see parallels. And Peter had mentioned these material support. I mean, he's talking about material support cases in which somebody's about to get on a plane. I have seen material support cases that are literally like a 17-year-old kid posting stuff online and going away to life, going away to prison for life in supermaxes. And I think at some point in our history, we're going to turn around and look at some of our cases and counterterrorism cases and be really deeply ashamed of them.
I think when you start to incentivize surveillance for whatever reason, it starts to bolster the confidence and the reach of local law enforcement. And so whether it's military equipment that leaves Afghanistan and ends up in Ferguson, or it's all of these grants that local cash-strapped agencies are now saying, okay, we're in counterterrorism, so we can get this type of support for our law enforcement, you start to see that this type of malfeasance is monetized and incentivized. And the thing I want to say about social media real quickly is that we're in this interesting moment in which we've seen social media platforms galvanize so many important movements, and at the same time, it makes so efficient the work of surveillance. And so it's this really mixed bag of how activists and activist communities want to get their message out and also make themselves more vulnerable to the reach of the state.
So does it make a difference for the connection to criminal justice reform of this particular case that it's a violent crime being discussed, that it's not the nonviolent drug offenses that so often get focused on?
Look, I think it's interesting, there's a lot of analysis done after Serial aired about why people were so fascinated with Serial, and one of those elements is that we do have a fascination with stories of young, beautiful women being hurt, being raped, being killed. I mean, this is a pattern, we see this all the time. And we see, and Hae, in that way, was not the average Baltimore victim. 7 months before Hae was killed, another young 18-year-old girl from Woodlawn was killed in a very similar manner, and her body was found in a park, and she was strangled as well. And nobody had ever heard her name. But when Hae disappeared and she was killed, certainly the fact that she came from a more prominent community, as a business community, they had more resources, they were able to kind of elevate that story over the stories of many, many young, I would say black women and black victims in Baltimore, whose names we never get to know. But yeah, I think we are a little bit obsessed as a society with cases that involve young, attractive women as victims. And I don't know how to further analyze that, but maybe Marcia has some thoughts on that.
Absolutely, and I think that the thing about the narrative in Serial was this, I mean, you talk about this in your book really well, about this dynamic of Woodlawn High School and then the magnet program. That this was a really high-profile crime that involved young people that no one ever imagines who could be involved in anything wrong. And I think that there was some model minority stuff that was also part of the analysis. And so I think that the question is, can we use a story like that to surface bigger issues and keep people engaged? And I think that what you're doing with Undisclosed Season 2 complicates a lot of these narratives because it's an all-white community. It involves someone who has a lot of prior bad acts, has a problematic relationship. Alleged bad acts. And at the same time, there is no question that this case is a real problem and has no evidence and no basis. And so I think that the more and more we're able to really disturb this idea of who the right victim is, and I think, again, this is one of the contributions of Black Lives Matter, that we are able to understand that this is about a system and not just about individuals.
Any other questions up front here?
I'm curious, when you say we have these fascinations with stories of beautiful young women, do you think that once they are matched in a capacity, I'm thinking along the lines of the Amanda Knox documentary that just came out, that was sort of prior to the podcasts coming out, as well as the Netflix series and all of that. If things would change for those older cases where there are sort of, they fit that mold of a young, beautiful woman being affected. And then secondly, you've talked a lot critically about the prosecution and this drive to fight back despite the evidence not being there. And I'm sort of curious if you have any thoughts as to why. Is it simply a matter of we don't want to be wrong, we don't want to admit that we screwed up the first time, or is there something else that's, the Maryland prosecutors as well as in Wisconsin fighting back against the Brennan Dassey case?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's just Maryland or Wisconsin. I think this is kind of, and this is very common. I think, in the West Memphis 3 case, which is a case that I was following for many years, and then led me eventually to contact a journalist, a similar thing happened in which these 3 young men were exonerated, and it was so clear that they were innocent of this crime. The state did not drop the charges. Instead, they offered them a plea. It saves the state maybe embarrassment, but also saves them from reopening the investigation, right? I mean, so if they're to fully accept an exoneration, if they're to say, okay, well, I mean, there's been so many cases in which a court has exonerated somebody, and you still have prosecutors saying, well, maybe they did, but I still think he did it. But I think what it does is that it gives the state a reason not to reopen an investigation, which, for...
Rabia, does it also protect the state from financial claims if the person takes an Alford plea? Is that also part of the reason why they do it?
I actually don't think that's so much of an incentive, because many times in Alford pleas, part of the settlement is that the person cannot sue the state. Many states have no settlements for wrongful convictions. I mean, there's some cases where I think this one gentleman wanted like $6,000 for his wrongful conviction and incarceration, and the state fought back, and he has no right to it statutorily. So I don't know if it's so much. I just think it's a culture. I think there is a culture. I mean, you have the attorney who represented Stephen Avery, Dean Strang. I interviewed him not long ago, and he said he worked in the prosecutor's office before he became a defense attorney, and he just couldn't fit. And I think you have personality types that cannot fit in a certain culture, and you have some that do. And so I do think it's a cultural thing. I think their incentives are different, their political reasons, but for whatever reason, I don't know, I would want to ask prosecutors this question really, like why do you keep fighting when it's so clear? Yeah, and finding other, incentivizing that system in a different way to get things right versus just to convict. There were a few questions on this end. Yeah.
Let's do right across and then.
I have a question about the accountability and holding people accountable. I'm a filmmaker. I'm working on a wrongful conviction case, which is a little bit odd because the woman was already executed, so there's no going back. But even so, getting the most basic information out of the police department and the DA's office, we've been filing FOIA after FOIA after FOIA, and it's just amazing to me the kind of dances that everybody's going around. Is there anyone who's starting to tackle this issue of accountability? I know it's really difficult because we're talking 50 states and however many different counties, and everybody's got their own thing. But how do we get to the point where information is accessible and that you have a right to look at it?
Yeah, access to information is one of the big challenges, and we've had the same thing. When we've filed FOIAs, we've gotten documents in different batches, and this batch will be missing things that luckily will show up in another batch. But we know that there are missing documents because we have evidence that certain things were collected, but they no longer exist, that certain people were interviewed, but those interviews don't exist. Like, where are they? And you go back to the same people who have every incentive not to give you the documents, it's a big issue. There are some jurisdictions that practice something called an open file policy, where everything that comes into the state's attorney's office, so everything to collect from the police, should theoretically be available defense. But even in that situation, they're the ones who are controlling the documents. They're the ones who have it, who can manipulate it if they want to. In terms of accountability, it's a real big problem. That's all I know. That's why I think having independent investigations is so important, right? So, but California recently, I don't know if they passed it or not, but a bill was proposed in which it would make it a felony for a prosecutor to withhold evidence. And that's the kind of legislative changes we need. We need to make it that serious of an offense in the criminal justice system. So that's one place that I've heard. I don't know about other places, yeah.
Rabia, a question for you. Can you talk a little bit about what Thoreau's leaving would mean for Adnan's case, one? And two, have you found inmates reaching out and to you at all, talking about, that sounds like an Alford plea that happened in my case, or a Brady violation. Do you feel like maybe some of the education that you've done in your podcast has really reached to inmates contacting you about potential cases that they, their own case or relatives and things like that?
The state's actually the Deputy Attorney General of Maryland, Thiru Vignarajah, recently we learned that he would be leaving the office very abruptly, and it was not an announcement they made. We then, a reporter reached out and confirmed that we had heard through other back channels, and he apparently, I think, just left at the end of September. What it means for the case, I don't know. I don't know what the internal actually there is an attorney who filed a FOIA-like instrument, MPIA, to find his personnel files to see, why is it that this guy is suddenly being asked to leave the office? Because it's very clear that he would not, I don't think, voluntarily just step out of a huge case and just drop it in the middle of, where they are right now. I'm hoping it fares well for Adnan. I'm hoping it means that the state will not be. Hi, Susan Simpson from Undisclosed. Thank you for joining us, my partner in crime. I hope it will mean that they are able to, because I personally feel like Thiru Vignarajah took the case very personally. In the PCR hearing that just happened, he made sure that I was sequestered from it. I thought that was kind of personal shot. So I'm hoping that they are able to kind of take a step back and have other fresh eyes come in. And I don't think it can get worse, is what I'm trying to say, but you never know. The second question was, we've had people reach out. We've had people reach out, not so much inmates themselves, although we've had a couple folks do that, but we've had family members and other folks, advocates, reach out and say, hey, we have this case, and can you take a look at this? In fact, Susan is right now looking at another case out of Baltimore in which a sister of a defendant, or actually convicted person, has asked for her to take a look at it. So we get a lot of requests, and it's kind of heartbreaking because you can't look at every one. And sometimes those requests are for crimes that are let's say, assault and robbery and things like that. And we just don't have the resources to put, I don't want to say those aren't serious charges and they don't get serious sentences, but if we have to prioritize where we're giving our attention, we're just not able to do it there. So there's a couple of questions here.
The lady in the yellow bracelet's been waiting a while.
Thank you so much, and I've really enjoyed your comments. I do criminal justice reform work on the state level, so your conversations about identity has been really helpful. And you mentioned whether or not we're going away from getting the right victim and the right spokesperson. And I think with the left-right kind of model on the local level, it feels like they're here at the table, but other people have been there for a very long time, and they're most interested in things that don't really have the most effect on the people who've been impacted for a long time. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. And Rabia, when you said earlier that you thought that Sarah was able to tell a really good story, and I'm a big NPR listener, but I wonder if it's also because she was white, if that played a part of it. You could have told the exact same story. Does her race and the fact that she's not part of the ethnic group of the person that she's telling the story about, if that made a difference at all?
I think that absolutely. This idea, for a number of people who have been on the ground since the war on drugs commenced, hearing that there's a new conversation about the war on drugs just makes you roll your eyes and just gasp, right? Because there's nothing new about the destruction that has happened in communities as a result. And I think one of the key areas where you're going to see some real questions and tensions are not just about the way that we amplify victims of this larger system, but the re-entry issues that are highly racialized and also are about class and access to resources. Because I think part of the appeal of an exoneree story is this person got out, that's amazing. But I think what the public needs to now focus on are the incredible obstacles for a person who has been released, whether they're exonerated or not, or just did their time. And so I think that on the local level, what needs to happen is that the reform piece has to be about the various steps of the process that we've been talking about, from the defense to the prosecutorial strategies, to the sentencing, to the conditions inside facilities, to all of the re-entry problems that a lot of communities disproportionately face. And so I think that with all this money and attention and resources, the people who have been at the table for the longest time, have to explain to the newcomers that this is about a trajectory, not just about a particular moment when we talk about criminal justice.
Yeah, it's an interesting point you raise about the popularity of serial, maybe not just about the story itself, but the storyteller. And I think that's absolutely true. I do think, and that's a knife that cuts both ways. I think if you had somebody who is from the Muslim community or from the community itself, or one of, shared an ethnicity with one of the major players in the story, maybe they would be viewed as being more biased, not being able to be as objective. But Sarah also brought in with, This American Life, like this built-in listenership of millions of people to begin with. So she already had a springboard, obviously that of a big following. And the other thing is, what's interesting to me, and I talk about this with a lot Muslim audiences when I sometimes have Muslim audiences, is I'm doing the book tour and I'm doing other talks, and we even did this gala with 400 people. I would say 95% of the support coming to Adnan is coming from white people. It is. I mean, whether it's donations, whether it is letters, whether it is support online, it is a very fascinating phenomenon to me. In fact, I almost feel like there's kind of like a radio silence from the Muslim community itself. So you're right. I mean, the story, like I said, I mean, for better or worse, it has worked to his benefit in his case. But I understand the implications there are a little bit troubling. I think Sarah, Sarah and Serial, I do think it was to their detriment that the entire team was not diverse. There wasn't a single person of color in their entire team, and I think that was to their detriment. I think if they had other people working with them who were connected to one of the communities or understood Baltimore or, came from a Muslim community, like they would have understood the story in a different way. But at the same time, we have certain results, and I feel like, it's terrible to say it, but it served our purpose.
Can I ask you a question about that? Do you think that there was also some inability to read the anti-Muslim sentiment in this story because it was a majority black jury?
Perhaps.
That a jury of color couldn't be discriminatory.
Could not be discriminatory. Yeah, I think, that also exists. This whole issue is really interesting to me because one thing, we have a lot of conversation about like the details of the case and the states fighting back on all the little, the timelines and the cell phone and this and that. And I wish, we were able to get to a point where these agencies can step back and say, forget all of these things. Let's talk about the fact that we made the center of our prosecution of a 17-year-old like his religion. Let's talk about how highly unconstitutional and unethical that was, because it's on the record. There's no way to escape that. And that alone should grant him a new trial. That alone. Forget all these other technical issues, Asia McLean and this witness and that witness. That never should have been held against him. We can't seem to get to that conversation. And a number of years ago, Justin Brown, who's his lawyer, and has been his appellate lawyer for 8 years, and I love Justin, I said to him, as you're raising issues for appeal, you should raise this issue. And he said, no, I don't really know. It's not a major issue. It's a major issue. Justin's also white, So I don't know how to understand like this kind of like blindness to what's so clearly on the record. There's a lady behind you. They've had their hands up for a while.
Hi. So I have kind of two separate questions that I'll keep super short. The first of which, I think the popularity of Serial, but also with Undisclosed, was largely because of the amount of information and evidence that, particularly with Undisclosed, that you provided, Rabia, and also Susan. So thank you. To that effect, as a public figure and also as a producer and a researcher, Rabia, how do you make the decisions about how to, or like what to include in terms of evidence in your podcasting? And then also to Marcia, as a strategist and an academic, how do you feel that if a new trial was granted to Adnan or this process were to continue in any sort of way, how certain pieces of information could factor it ultimately into a decision?
Okay, so on the first question, I honestly, actually, I'm going to defer to Susan and she can answer, but because first of all, at least 95, maybe 90 to 95% of the evidence and information that is kind of newly discovered comes from Susan. She's the one who like really identifies it. And then you know, it was different with Adnan's case because, you know, I had a personal connection and I understood. I mean, even now there is information and evidence that we haven't made public that we know we have to like wait on. We know there's maybe a new trial coming. There's certain times that it's better to make available, and so oftentimes we defer to his attorney on that. In this current situation, you know, Susan is really the one who understands kind of the world, the entire universe of all the different witnesses, the legal mechanisms, and is best able to make the decision. But Susan, could you address that for a bit? Like how, there are times when I know I have said, oh, we should talk about this, and she's like, nope, this is not the time.
Well, there's two levels. Like you said, there's also the strategic element, or it's not even strategic, it's more stuff that's legally significant, and we know that for various reasons, we're better off, you know, waiting a bit on it. And then there's also the level of information that came up in the case, both for Adnan and Joey. It came up in the case, it was a part of the prosecution's case, and I kind of have a constant fear of, not a fear, but I don't want to be accused of leaving out critical information, of leaving out stuff that shows guilt. So, as you might have noticed, we tend to err on the side of including everything. But at a certain point, a lot of it becomes redundant, pointless, and stupid, basically. And so there's stuff we have to leave out, and I'm always like, I know one day someone's going to come back and be like, oh, look, they left out the smoking gun. When really, there was just so much boring claims from the prosecutor that we couldn't force listeners to sit through it all.
And on that second question, just real quickly, I think that if this were the new trial, what's interesting about Serial is that I'm a big NPR, This American Life. You know, we're the tote bag America. You know, like liberal elites like myself who are professors, you know, we do a deep dive into this kind of stuff. And we also forget that there's a critical mass of people who have no idea what Serial is and don't know who Adnan Syed is, which I think is so weird. But that just talks about the orbit in which I live. With that being said, I think that other orbit is probably more representative of who might be on a jury if this case went forward again. And they may not be shaped so much by Serial and Undisclosed, but by Freddie Gray, Michael Brown, you know, Philando Castile, and that the possibility that the police could be up to something as a way of understanding a case like this, I think would be very powerful with that audience. And I also think that, you know, it's interesting, all of the O.J. Simpson memorabilia stuff, which is weird if you lived through it the first time to watch it kind of play out again. But I remember a time where people would have these conversations back and forth where, do you think the LAPD could actually set someone up? And this was a question. And I think that people still ask those questions, but in a very different tone and in a very different spirit. So I think that that is what is actually the Ferguson effect. It's not that people are now imperiling police in this new way. I think we just have a very different sensibility about all these various systems.
So let's take one last question. I think there was right behind.
Isn't that going to be me?
Was there two? Yeah, let's take Lisa and then. Yep.
Sorry, guys. I work here, so it's like my questions always get answered last. So thank you both for coming. I actually have two questions, and I'll try to get through them really fast. The first one is I just was curious about, Rabia, your relationship and Adnan's family's relationship to the podcast. I mean, I know they were, from your book, I know that they were originally skeptical about, you know, giving this to the media and like offering their family up for public consumption. And I know it must have been really hard for them to kind of hear this stuff and see this in the news all the time. And if you ever kind of felt like at odds with, you know, not with the podcast in the sense that, you know, you're kind of giving up your story and giving up license to tell it, and, you know, it just kind of creates a struggle. And I guess my other question was, also in the book, I was a little confused, I guess, at which point Asia McLean's at which point she decided to testify in Adnan's defense and file that affidavit.
So, yeah, no, my relationship with Adnan's family, I mean, like his parents, his family, whatever, and Adnan himself. Adnan himself was very skeptical. I mean, Adnan said okay to Sarah, to talking to her, to being part of this process, because in a way he didn't want to hurt me, because I just felt so like that this is something we have to do now. And he was skeptical of it. He has just experienced being branded as somebody who's manipulative, who's not, like he's just so fearful, and he's created this bubble inside prison, which, I mean, now we're thinking about reentry, and we've never thought about these issues before, and I think it's going to be very difficult, in fact, as we're considering these things, it was very hard for him to allow somebody into that space. Obviously, having on this end of the process, they are all very, very happy that they went through it. It's been worth it. And it's not done, obviously. There's still a lot more that they're going to have to go through before this is over. But, you know, my relationship to his brother, they all have, and if I've written a little bit about this in the book, the family was really badly damaged after Adnan was arrested. Everybody kind of suffered it in their own terrible way. And his older brother has been estranged for years. The younger brother was 9 when Adnan was arrested, and he's just like, his trauma just doesn't seem to end. And I sometimes think that Adnan might be the most well-adjusted of the entire family. So he's going to have a lot to deal with when he gets out. I mean, this damage is going to take many, many years to fix, if possible. But my relationship with them is just, I'm there to support them as much as I can. And I tried for a while to try to get involved in the family dynamics and help and heal. And I realized this is just not my space, and I'm not good at this. And I have to focus on like just helping Adnan, and then that will have to happen by itself. But we're in a good place. We're in a much more positive place than we've ever been. The second question, Asia McLean, it was when Asia herself listened to Serial, and when she heard the prosecutor say that Asia had contacted him, Uric, and said that she was forced to make those documents or coerced or whatever, that she just was floored, and she said it's not true. It wasn't true. So she contacted Sarah and said that that's a lie. Like, I never said that to him. And I think after that, Sarah put her in contact with Adnan's attorney, and that's when they decided, well, he said you need your own attorney, but that's when she made the decision that she had to do something. She just felt really, and she wrote a book too, and her book is pretty good, if you guys want to read more about her perspective on this. And the sad thing is, as a witness who is completely impartial, has nothing, like no pony in this race, she's really been vilified and attacked a lot by state actors and prosecution and stuff. So, but you know, we're ever thankful to Asia for stepping up when she realized something had been done. Basically, a prosecutor had lied under oath. So.
Any concluding statements? Or?
Concluding statements are, the only thing I want to conclude with is that, you know, a lot of people ask the question, okay, but what about Hae? Let's say Adnan gets out because of the appeal. Let's say he serves his sentence because of this ACLU lawsuit. Then what about Hae? And I want to tell people that not just me, but the investigators who are involved, Adnan's supporters, we also do think about Hae. And the state failed Hae, and I don't personally think the state will ever reopen the investigation, but we have had an off-the-record ongoing investigation for the last year, and are looking very much so to be able to not just exonerate Adnan, but to actually solve the case itself and bring to justice the person who killed Hae. So that's one thing that I want to make clear. A lot of that information is probably going to come out in the public next year, in 2017. So the story is far from over. So I hope you continue to pay attention, but also to support the work of people on a local level who are doing this work day in and day out and have been doing it for decades.
If you ever find yourself in a position saying there's so many problems, you know, where do I fit into all of this, especially a lot of the conversations about race and justice, there are so many parts of this that are accessible to everyday people, and there's so many ways that you can make an intervention in this large process, whether it's making sure that you are participating in programs to help support education inside of prisons. The Girl Scouts of America, I'm going to do a big plug for them, they have a program called Girl Scouting Beyond Bars for girls whose mothers are incarcerated, as well as teenage women who are in facilities. If you love Girl Scouting, this is a way to help. There's so many places. Sending books to prison. I think sometimes when we think about this behemoth of racial injustice in the criminal justice system, we don't even know where we start. We know that we don't have the capacity to become attorneys or to have great podcasts, but we do have the capacity to make sure that people don't get left behind. So always keep that in mind.
Well, thanks. The book is on sale outside for those of you who have not gotten your copy yet, and I'm sure Rabia will sign your copy and answer any burning questions we didn't get to.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.